There are nights when the air feels too perfect to carry bad news, when every smile around you seems untouched by anything sharp. That was the night of my sister Sophie's wedding. I walked in ready to celebrate, to play my part as the supportive older sister, but beneath the music and the glow of the lights, something was shifting. I could feel it before I could name it, the way you sense a storm far out at sea, hidden beyond the horizon, moving closer with every passing moment. When Mark and I walked into the reception hall, the first thing I saw was my mother bent over Sophie's dress, her hands smoothing the lace bodice with a tenderness I could almost feel from across the room. My father stood beside her, watching like he was guarding some priceless treasure. The air smelled faintly of roses and vanilla from the centerpiece arrangements, and the murmur of conversation mixed with the gentle clink of glasses. I felt Mark's palm press against the small of my back as we moved toward our table. He was smiling, but I could tell his eyes were scanning the room the way mine were. Everyone seemed lit from within, especially my parents. My mother's cheeks were flushed, her hair freshly set, and she kept adjusting Sophie's veil as if the camera crews from some magazine were about to arrive. My father had that rare upright posture I had not seen since I was a child, his tie perfectly straight, shoes polished to a shine. We found our seats halfway down the room, not at the head table where Sophie and Luke sat flanked by my parents, but close enough to see their faces clearly. Mark brushed my hand under the table and gave it a gentle squeeze. I knew what he was thinking, but neither of us said anything. Today was supposed to be about Sophie. The chatter dimmed as the DJ announced the couple's entrance. Sophie floated in on Luke's arm, the skirt of her gown sweeping behind her in soft folds. My parents rose to greet them, my father kissing her cheek, my mother dabbing at her eyes. Cameras flashed from every angle. I clapped with everyone else, my smile in place, but somewhere under my ribs a small knot tightened. Dinner passed in a blur. Servers moved efficiently between tables with plates of salmon and roasted vegetables. I caught pieces of conversation from nearby tables, old neighbors reminiscing about Sophie's childhood, coworkers of Luke complimenting the decorations. Mark chatted politely with a man from Luke's office while I pushed a forkful of asparagus around my plate. Then my mother's voice rang out. She stood at the head table holding a champagne flute, my father rising beside her. The room quieted as she tapped the side of the glass with a fork. Her smile was wide, her eyes sweeping over the guests like a performer before the big reveal. "We are so grateful," she began, "to have so many of you here to celebrate Sophie and Luke." My father nodded along, adding how Sophie had always been such a joy, so full of light. I waited for the usual polite thanks and for the toasts to move on. Instead, my mother reached into her handbag and pulled out a crisp folder. "Your father and I wanted to give you something meaningful," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound emotional. "Something to help you start your life together." She paused, looked at my father, and then back to Sophie and Luke. "We are giving you the family home." For a moment, I heard nothing at all. The words seemed to drop into the room like a stone into still water. Then the applause started, loud and enthusiastic. People stood clinking glasses, cheering. Sophie pressed both hands to her mouth, her eyes glistening. Luke wrapped an arm around her shoulders, beaming. I sat very still. Mark's fingers tightened around mine under the table until I realized I had been holding my breath. The family home. The same house I had been making payments on every month for 5 years, $1,600 from January 2016 until the mortgage was finally cleared in December 2021. The same house my parents had begged me to save when Dad's hours were cut at the garage and Mom's arthritis kept her from sewing more than a few days a week. The same house they promised I would never regret helping with. There had been no warning, no conversation, not even a hint this might happen. My smile stayed fixed because every eye seemed turned toward the head table. Mark leaned close enough that his shoulder brushed mine. "Did you know about this?" he whispered. I shook my head slowly, keeping my lips pressed tight. As the clapping died down, Sophie left her seat and made her way toward us. She bent slightly, her perfume sweet and strong. "Can you believe it?" she whispered, her tone bright but her eyes calm in a way that told me she had known for some time. Before I could answer, she was moving on, accepting more congratulations from another table. I took a sip of my water, my fingers trembling just enough to make the ice clink against the glass. From the corner of my eye, I saw Aunt Linda lean toward me, her voice low. "You're the one who paid for that place, aren't you?" I forced a small smile, the kind you give when you do not trust your voice to hold steady, and nodded once before looking away. Mark's hand stayed over mine until the music started again and guests returned to their meals. I cut into the salmon, tasted nothing, and let the noise of the celebration wash over me. In the glow of the string lights, my parents were radiant, Sophie was radiant, and I sat in the middle of it all, feeling like the air had shifted heavy and sharp, carrying the first signs of a storm I had not seen coming. I could still picture the kitchen the way it looked that winter evening in 2016, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence while my parents sat across from me at the worn oak table. Dad's hands were clasped together, his nails still rimmed with grease from the garage. Mom kept rubbing her wrists as if the motion might ease the ache. Outside the window, the porch light flickered, snow falling in lazy spirals over the cracked driveway. Dad cleared his throat, eyes fixed on the mug in front of him. "They cut my hours at the shop again," he said, voice low, like he was embarrassed to let the words out. "I am not sure when they will go back to full-time." Mom glanced at him, then back at me. "The sewing orders have slowed," she added. "I can barely get through the ones I have with my hands the way they are." I knew where this was going before they even said it. The bank had sent notices. I had seen the pile of envelopes on the counter. Dad looked up finally, his eyes tired. "We are behind, Hannah. If we do not catch up soon, we could lose the house. We thought maybe you could help. Just for a while. Until things get better." There was no talk of contracts or formal agreements. No mention of interest or repayment plans. Only the unspoken truth that this was the home I had grown up in, the place where I had taken my first steps and painted my bedroom walls a stubborn shade of teal at 16. I had been working full-time at the marketing firm for almost 4 years, then saving for a condo of my own. I thought of that savings account, the number I had been watching grow, and felt it shrink in my mind. I nodded slowly. "I can do it." Mom's shoulders dropped in relief. "Thank you, honey," she said. Dad managed a small smile. "We will make it up to you, I promise." I believed him. The first payment came out of my account the following week. $1,600 wired directly to the mortgage company. I remember staring at the confirmation email, the line that said "payment received," and feeling a knot in my stomach. I told myself it was just for a few months. Months turned into years. Every first of the month, I sent the payment, sometimes more when property taxes came due or the water heater needed replacing. I skipped vacations, drove my 10-year-old Civic until the paint peeled from the hood, said no to dinners out when friends asked. My apartment was a one-bedroom in a building that smelled faintly of mildew in the summer, but it was cheap and close to work. I told myself it was fine, it was temporary. I can still see the stack of bank statements on my desk, each one with that line item circled in red pen. Payment to mortgage company. I kept every receipt, every transfer confirmation, partly out of habit, partly because some quiet part of me feared I might need proof someday. There were small moments of gratitude then. Like the day Mom called after a payment cleared and said, "If it were not for you, we would have lost this place by now." Or when Dad surprised me with a box of cinnamon rolls from the bakery I liked, setting it on my kitchen counter without a word before heading back to his truck. Those moments mattered enough to quiet the voice in my head that sometimes wondered how long this would go on. In December 2021, I sent the final payment. The mortgage was cleared. I remember calling Dad to tell him. He laughed a short sound of disbelief, then said, "Guess we can all breathe easier now." I thought maybe there would be some kind of acknowledgement, maybe even a family dinner to mark the milestone. Instead, life went on. The next time I visited Mom was repainting the living room, talking about hosting Sophie's engagement party there. Looking back now, I realize I never once asked for anything in writing. I never insisted on boundaries or timelines. I trusted that the unspoken promise between us would be enough. That when they were back on their feet, we would talk about what came next. I did not imagine that the next big conversation about that house would happen in front of 200 people under the glow of fairy lights. The music from the reception was still faintly ringing in my ears as I sat there, fork resting on my plate. Mark glanced at me, his brow furrowed, but he didn't push. Across the room, my parents were laughing with Sophie and Luke raising their glasses for a photo. The photographer caught them mid-toast, their faces open and joyful. I thought about all those years, the cold mornings driving to work before sunrise, the extra projects I took on to cover the payments, the quiet dinners alone in my apartment because I couldn't afford to go out. And now the house was theirs to give away, like my part in saving it had been just a footnote. The applause from another toast rippled through the room, pulling me back to the present. I took a sip of water and let it settle in my chest. There was nothing to say here, not tonight. But deep down, something in me shifted, the kind of shift you feel when a door you thought was open swings quietly shut. The band started a slow song and couples made their way onto the dance floor. The soft hum of conversation mixed with the clink of forks on dessert plates. Mark was halfway through his coffee when he leaned toward me and asked if I wanted another. I shook my head, still feeling the weight of what I had just heard announced from the head table. He kissed my temple lightly before standing, and I watched him disappear into the line forming near the bar. That was when Sophie appeared at my side. She had slipped away from her circle of friends, her gown bunched in one hand to keep it from dragging. The overhead lights caught the beads along the bodice, scattering little sparks of light across her skin. She leaned close, so close I could smell the floral sweetness of her perfume over the faint scent of champagne. "You think it's perfect, don't you?" she said, her voice quiet but edged with something that didn't match her smile. It was not a question. It was a challenge, the kind that dares you to deny what she already believes. Her eyes held mine just long enough for me to understand. She had known for weeks, maybe months, that the house was going to be hers. I forced my lips into a small smile, the kind that gave nothing away. Before I could answer, she straightened and moved on, twirling a little as she joined another group of guests who were waiting to congratulate her again. Her laughter floated back to me, high and easy. Mark returned with his coffee, setting it down in front of him and glancing in Sophie's direction. "What did she say?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes searching mine. "Nothing that matters," I said, wrapping both hands around my glass of water. The condensation was cool against my palms. I took a sip just to have something to do, my gaze fixed on a spot in the middle distance. We sat through another round of toasts, though I barely registered the words. Luke's uncle told a story about their college days, drawing polite laughs. Someone clinked a glass for the couple to kiss, and I joined in the applause without thinking. My parents were still glowing, their hands resting on Sophie's shoulders like they were anchoring her to the moment. When the music picked up again, we decided it was time to leave. We made our way to the head table, weaving through clusters of guests. Sophie hugged me, careful not to crush the delicate flowers pinned in her hair. Luke shook Mark's hand, smiling warmly. My parents were busy talking to neighbors from the old block, so we just waved as we stepped away. They waved back, distracted, and I felt a small pang at how easy it was for them to let us go. Outside, the night air was cool and smelled faintly of wet pavement. The parking lot was strung with white lights, their reflection shimmering on the hoods of the cars. We walked in silence until we reached ours. Once we were inside, Mark started the engine but didn't shift into gear right away. "You want to stop by their place tonight?" he asked. "We could talk to them while it's fresh." I stared out the windshield at the line of taillights leaving the lot. "Not tonight," I said. "It's their night. I don't want to be the one who makes it ugly." He eased the car onto the road, the tires hissing over damp asphalt. "They already made it ugly, Hannah. The way they did that in front of everyone." His voice was steady but tight. "I know," I said, softer than I meant to. "I need to think." Streetlights slid across the dashboard in slow intervals, each one throwing his profile into brief relief before we were back in shadow. At a long red light, he reached over and took my hand. His thumb moved once across my skin, deliberate and sure. "I'm not letting this go," he said, the words slow and unshakable. I turned to meet his eyes and nodded. "I know you won't." We passed familiar blocks of closed shops and darkened houses, the kind of streets that felt both comforting and empty at night. My mind kept looping back to Sophie's face, leaning toward mine, the slight tilt of her head, the satisfaction she didn't bother hiding. She had known all along and hadn't thought to say a word to me. Or maybe she had thought about it and decided she liked the idea of surprising me with everyone else. By the time we pulled into our driveway, my thoughts had started to harden, shaping themselves into something I wasn't ready to name. I carried my purse inside, dropped my keys in the ceramic dish by the door, and kicked off my shoes. Mark hung his jacket by the entryway and went into the kitchen, the sound of cabinets opening and closing, carrying into the living room. Upstairs, I unzipped my dress and hung it on the hook behind the bedroom door. The faint scent of Sophie's perfume clung to the fabric from when she had hugged me. I washed my face, watching the black streaks of mascara swirl in the sink until the water ran clear. In the mirror, my expression was still calm, but my eyes looked sharper somehow, like they were cataloging details for later. When I came back down, Mark was pouring himself a glass of water. He asked if I wanted one, and I shook my head. We moved through the familiar rhythm of locking up the house, turning off lights, setting our phones on the nightstand. The rain had started again, tapping lightly against the windows. I lay in bed listening to the soft patter above us. Mark settled beside me, his breathing even. The house felt wrapped in stillness, the kind that settles in just before something changes. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes adjusted to the dark, my mind tracing the path from that kitchen table in 2016 to the head table tonight. Somewhere in between, the balance had shifted, and now I was left with the uneasy knowledge that it might never shift back. A few weeks later, my phone lit up with my mother's name. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was standing at the kitchen counter slicing vegetables for dinner. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me still answered out of habit. Her voice was warm, almost cheerful, as if the wedding had wiped away any strain. "Sophie and Luke are back from their honeymoon," she said. "We're having a little dinner here Saturday night. Just family. You and Mark should come." I told her we would. When I hung up, Mark looked over from where he was seasoning chicken. "What's the occasion?" he asked. I shrugged. She said it's casual. Sophie wants to share pictures from Florida. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't press. Saturday evening, we pulled into my parents' driveway. The house looked the same as it always had, except for a new wreath on the door, a beachy design with shells woven into pale blue ribbon. Inside, the living room smelled of pot roast and fresh bread. Sophie was in the dining room flipping through her phone while Luke adjusted a picture frame on the wall. They greeted us with smiles. Sophie immediately started showing me photos, scrolling quickly through shots of palm trees, sandy beaches, and plates of seafood. She talked about the warm weather, the dolphins they had seen on a boat tour, the boutique hotel with the balcony overlooking the water. I nodded in the right places, complimented the sunsets, and told her the shrimp looked amazing. We sat down to eat, the table set with Mom's best dishes. Dad carved the roast while Mom passed around baskets of bread. Conversation flowed easily at first, centering on the honeymoon and little updates about neighbors. Mark asked Luke about his new job, and Luke answered politely, though he seemed more interested in refilling Sophie's wine glass than talking about work. Halfway through the meal, Mom cleared her throat. The tone shifted. "You know, she began your father, and I have been thinking about making a change." She glanced at Dad, who nodded as he set down his fork. "We're not getting any younger, Hannah. That big house is too much for us now. Out in the mountains, it's quiet and peaceful. Perfect for our age." I knew exactly where she was going before she said it. "We would like to move into Silver Pines Cabin," she continued. "It's such a lovely place, and you hardly use it." Dad chimed in, leaning forward slightly. "You could let us have it just to live there. We'd take good care of it." I set my fork down, keeping my voice steady. "Number." The word was simple, clear. Mom blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Well, you wouldn't have to worry about it sitting empty," she tried again. I shook my head. "It's not available. It's mine." The room seemed to still. Dad frowned, his brows drawing together. "Be reasonable, Hannah. We can't keep up with the house forever." Sophie's voice broke in, then a sharp edge under her sweetness. "You hardly ever go up there. It's not like you need it." My eyes shifted to her. "It's mine," I said again, "and I decide who uses it." Sophie's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're being selfish." The words landed heavier than I expected, not because they hurt, but because they were so familiar in tone. I had heard them before in different ways from different people in this family. Mark's hand brushed my arm under the table, a small anchor. I kept my posture relaxed, my gaze steady. The silence stretched just long enough to make the air feel tight. Mom cleared her throat again, this time with less conviction. "Well, it's just something we were thinking about. We can talk later." Dinner went on, but the easy flow was gone. Conversation turned back to safe topics, weather and recipes, and small neighborhood news. I answered politely when spoken to, but didn't offer much. My appetite had faded. Mark filled the empty space by asking Luke about some fishing spot in Florida, and Luke took the bait, talking for a few minutes, while Sophie scrolled through her phone. When dessert came, slices of apple pie with melting scoops of vanilla ice cream, I thanked Mom for the meal. It was easier to be polite than to pick a fight in front of everyone. As soon as it was reasonable, Mark and I stood to leave. Sophie hugged me with the kind of politeness that keeps bodies from touching too much, and Luke gave a quick handshake. Dad walked us to the door, his expression neutral, but I caught the slight shake of his head as if I had disappointed him. Outside, the evening air was cooler than I expected. We walked to the car without speaking, the crunch of gravel under our shoes the only sound. Once inside, Mark started the engine, but didn't put it in gear right away. "You did fine," he said finally. I looked out at the street where the lamplight pooled on the pavement. I didn't feel fine. I felt the start of something harder settling in. We drove away from my parents' house, the yellow porch light fading in the rearview mirror. The road was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you notice every sound inside the car. Mark kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set in that way it gets when he is thinking through something he knows will turn into a conversation later. I leaned my head against the window and watched the streetlights blur past their reflections stretching across the hood. The motion of the car pulled me into an older memory, one I had not thought about in a long time. It was 2016, a cold Sunday afternoon. I had been sitting at that same kitchen table when my parents told me about falling behind on the mortgage. I remembered my father's voice, low but insistent, and my mother's quiet nods between his sentences. Toward the end of the conversation, after I had already said yes to helping, Mom had looked at me with an almost relieved smile. "One day this house will be yours." She had said it as if it were a certainty, as if my sacrifice was part of some inevitable plan. Back then, I had believed her. The drive home from dinner felt longer than usual. Neither of us turned on the radio. When we pulled into our driveway, the motion sensor light washed over the hood of the car. Inside, I dropped my bag by the couch and went to change into something comfortable. Mark was in the kitchen filling a glass of water when I came back down. He leaned against the counter and said we should think about collecting the extra keys to the cabin, just to be safe. I nodded, my fingers tracing the edge of the couch cushion. I had given my parents a set years ago in case of emergencies. At the time, it felt natural, like leaving a spare with a neighbor you trust. Now, after what had been said at the table tonight, it felt like a loose thread I should have pulled back in a long time ago. I told Mark I would take care of it. Later that night, while he was upstairs getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from Maggie, one of my coworkers at Northwest Living Interiors. She's the type who notices everything, and when her messages come late in the evening, it is usually something worth looking at. The preview on the screen showed a link to Craigslist with no explanation. I opened it. The page loaded slowly, the white screen giving way to a bold headline that made my stomach tighten. "Mountain cabin for sale, private listing." The first photo was of a porch I knew better than my own living room, the pine railing just slightly warped from years of snow and sun. The stone path, the green-trimmed windows, even the carved welcome sign I had hung the summer after buying it. All of it unmistakable. My Silver Pines cabin. I scrolled down, scanning the description. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, modern kitchen, new roofing in 2020. The asking price sat in black type, and under it was a contact email. It was not my parents' names, but it was close enough. A cousin on my mother's side who I had not spoken to in years. The same cousin who sometimes did odd jobs for my dad when he needed extra help. My pulse picked up. I checked the photos again as if I could be wrong. But there was no mistake. The kitchen photo showed the blue ceramic canisters I kept on the counter, the ones Mark's sister had given us for Christmas. Whoever took these pictures had been inside recently. I typed back to Maggie. "Where did you find this?" She replied almost instantly. "Was looking for a rental for my sister, saw it under private listings. Recognized it from your Instagram. Thought you should know." My thumbs hovered over the keyboard. "Thanks," I wrote back. "I owe you." Mark came down the stairs pulling on a sweatshirt. "Who was that?" he asked, noticing my expression. I turned the phone so he could see. His eyes narrowed as he scrolled through the listing. "That's your cabin." I nodded, feeling the heat rise in my chest. "And that's not you selling it?" "No," I said. "It's someone connected to my parents." We sat on the couch, the glow of the phone between us. Mark handed it back after a minute. "This is exactly why I said we need to get those keys back. If they think they can just put it up for sale, they'll think they can move in, rent it out, whatever they want." I could hear the frustration under his voice, the same kind that had been simmering since the wedding. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. There was a part of me that wanted to call my parents right then, demand an explanation. Another part knew that if I did, they would just deny it, twist the conversation until I was the one overreacting. The thought made my hands ache from clenching them. Mark reached over, resting his hand on my knee. "We will handle it," he said. "But we do it on our terms." I nodded, the image of that porch still sharp in my mind. My parents asking for the cabin at dinner had felt like a line crossing. Seeing it listed for sale without my knowledge felt like the start of something else entirely. The next morning, I woke before the alarm, the faint light through the curtains turning the room a pale gray. Mark was still asleep, his arm draped over the pillow where I had been lying. I slipped out of bed and went downstairs, the boards creaking under my feet. The cabin listing had followed me into my dreams, blurring with images of my parents at the dinner table, their voices calm as if they were entitled to it all. At the kitchen table, I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not used in years. Claire Dawson. We had sat next to each other in American Lit junior year, both working part-time jobs at the bookstore downtown. She had gone on to law school while I stayed in marketing, and from the occasional updates on social media, I knew she specialized in real estate law. I stared at her number for a moment before pressing call. She picked up on the second ring. "Hannah Carter," she said, her voice warm but curious. "I have not heard from you in forever. What is going on?" I hesitated, then told her I needed advice about a property I own. I gave her the short version, leaving out some of the family tension, and asked if she had time to meet. Her tone shifted, slightly more professional. "I can see you this afternoon if you come by my office. Bring whatever documents you have." Mark insisted on coming with me. We drove downtown, the late morning sun glinting off the courthouse steps as we passed. Claire's office was on the second floor of a restored brick building, her name in gold lettering on the glass door. She met us in the lobby, looking almost exactly as I remembered, though her hair was shorter now and she carried herself with the easy confidence of someone used to being listened to. We settled into her office, the scent of fresh coffee in the air. I slid the folder across the desk. Inside were the cabin's deed, the mortgage payoff statement from last year, and a few utility bills with my name. Claire flipped through each page carefully, her expression unreadable. When she looked up, her voice was steady. "Hannah, this cabin is yours. The deed is in your name only. Your parents have no legal claim to sell it or occupy it without your permission." I felt my shoulders loosen slightly, the tension easing just enough to breathe. Then she tapped the folder. "That said, possession is 9/10 of the law. If they have keys, if they enter the property and change the locks, you will have a mess on your hands. My advice is to change the locks immediately, retrieve any copies of the keys you can, and make it clear in writing that no one is authorized to enter without your consent." Mark leaned forward. "What about preventing them from trying this again?" Claire considered. "You could execute a limited power of attorney naming someone you trust, maybe even me, to manage the property if you are unavailable. That way, if they attempt anything while you are out of town, your representative can act on your behalf immediately." I nodded slowly, the practical part of me already ticking through the steps. Claire took a sip of coffee and then asked the question that made my pulse hitch. If they ignore you and enter the cabin without permission, are you willing to call the police? The image came unbidden my mother's face, my father's voice trying to reason his way out of it. I wanted to say no, that family came before everything, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. They had already crossed one line. I looked at Claire and then at Mark. He was watching me, waiting. Yes, I said finally. If it comes to that, I will. Claire nodded once, not with satisfaction, but with the acknowledgement of someone who knows a client just made a hard decision. Then let's start with the basics. She pulled out a notepad, jotting down the locksmith's name, the recommended hardware store, and a few other contacts. I took the list, the paper warm from her hand. On the way out, she walked us to the door. Hannah, she said, her voice softening. I have seen families torn apart over less. Protect yourself. It does not make you the bad guy. We stepped back into the sunlight, the air brisk against my skin. Mark slid his sunglasses on and glanced at me. You okay? I tucked the list into my bag. I will be. The drive home was quiet again, but this time it felt purposeful. I had a plan, and even if it meant taking steps I never thought I would take against my own parents, I knew I could not afford to wait for them to make the next move. It was late in the afternoon when my phone buzzed with the Safeguard security alert. The notification was short and sharp, a red banner flashing across the screen that the front door at Silver Pines cabin had been opened. My stomach tightened. I checked the calendar, retraced my memory. Neither Mark nor I had planned to be there, and the cabin was locked after my last visit 2 weeks ago. I pressed the live feed from the security app. The image flickered and then steadied. The front door stood wide open, a shadow moving across the porch. I hit the audio button. The faint scrape of something heavy being dragged, followed by muffled voices, reached my ear. My chest went cold. Without thinking, I tapped the emergency contact option in the app, which connected me to Safeguard's dispatch. This is Hannah Carter, I said, my voice tight. That is my property. No one should be there. Call the police. The dispatcher confirmed the address and told me officers were en route. I grabbed my jacket and keys. Mark was in the garage sorting boxes when I burst in. The cabin, I said, breathless. Someone is there. His face hardened instantly. We took my car. By the time we reached the narrow gravel drive leading up to the cabin, the sun was sinking, casting long blue shadows through the pines. A police SUV was parked out front, lights flashing silently. Officer Reynolds, a tall man in his 40s with steady eyes, stood near the steps, speaking to two figures I knew too well. My parents. Gerald had his hands on his hips, his expression caught somewhere between defensive and casual. Evelyn stood beside him with a plastic storage bin at her feet, her lips pressed tight. The sight made something in my chest lock into place. Officer Reynolds turned as I approached. Ma'am, are you the owner? Yes, I said, stepping closer. This is my property. I did not give anyone permission to be here. Evelyn's head snapped toward me. Hannah, we were just moving some of our things in before the snow comes. Gerald lifted his chin. You hardly use the place. We thought it would be easier to get settled before the roads ice over. My pulse pounded in my ears. You broke in, I said. Who gave you the key? Evelyn crossed her arms. If you had let us stay when we asked, it would not have come to this. Her voice carried that sharp edge I knew too well, the one meant to flip guilt back onto me. I looked to Officer Reynolds. The locks were changed last month. They had no right to enter. He nodded, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. Just to be clear, they are your parents, yes. He shifted his gaze to them. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, she is the legal owner. Without her consent, you cannot be here or remove anything from the property. Gerald's mouth tightened, but Evelyn's eyes narrowed with something darker than frustration. You really would call the police on your own family? I held her stare. You left me no choice. There was a long beat where the only sound was the wind moving through the pines. Finally, Reynolds asked them to step back while he finished his report. He told me he could file a formal trespass warning, which would mean they could be arrested if they returned without permission. Mark's hand was warm against my back, steadying me. I told Reynolds to file it. Evelyn let out a sharp breath, the kind that carried both disbelief and mockery. "You will regret this," she said quietly. Gerald picked up the storage bin and set it down on the porch with more force than necessary. Reynolds asked them to collect anything they had brought and leave. I watched them carry 2 more bins to their car, the red taillights disappearing down the drive moments later. The cabin's interior smelled faintly of dust and pine cleaner. A few cupboard doors stood open, and in the corner the quilt I kept folded on the couch was thrown over a chair. I closed the front door and locked it, the click of the deadbolt sounding final. Mark walked through each room with me, checking windows and closets. When we stepped back outside, the forest felt still again the way it had before. But my heart had not settled. As we drove away, the cabin shrinking behind us, I knew something had shifted. They had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed, and I had answered in kind. The patrol car was still idling at the end of the gravel drive when we pulled in, its headlights casting long white beams over the porch. Officer Reynolds stood in the glow, jotting something in his notepad, while Gerald and Evelyn hovered in the doorway of the cabin, both of them looking like they had been caught in the middle of some private task they didn't want anyone to see. Evelyn's arms were folded tight across her chest, and Gerald's hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, shoulders hunched as if bracing against more than the November chill. Evelyn was the first to speak, her voice sharp and carrying easily through the cold air. "This is absurd, Hannah. You are blowing this completely out of proportion. We weren't doing anything wrong. We were only getting the place ready so we could finally use it." "You do not have permission to be here," I said. "The locks were changed weeks ago." Gerald's mouth twisted. "We raised you better than this. You could have talked to us like family instead of calling the police." Officer Reynolds stepped closer, glancing between us. "Ma'am, just to confirm, they are not authorized to enter or remain on the property." "Correct," I said, my voice steady. "This cabin is mine. They have no right to be here." Gerald muttered something under his breath, but Evelyn pressed on. "You barely come here, Hannah. It's selfish to let it sit empty when we could be enjoying it." "It's not selfish to protect what I own," I told her. Reynolds' expression didn't change, but he asked the question I knew was coming. "Do you want to press charges?" The words felt heavier than the air between us. My parents stared at me, their eyes full of disbelief, but there was no trace of shame. I thought of the years of mortgage payments, the nights spent moving numbers around just to cover what they couldn't. I thought of every promise that had evaporated the moment it stopped benefiting them. "Yes," I said finally. "But not long term. Just hold them until they understand this isn't negotiable." Evelyn's eyes widened in horror. "You would have your own parents arrested. You made that choice when you came here," I said quietly. The second officer moved in, speaking softly as he took hold of Gerald's arm. The sound of handcuffs locking into place cut through the stillness like a snap of ice. Evelyn kept her gaze locked on me as they led her toward the patrol car, her voice rising with practiced outrage. "You will regret this, Hannah." Maybe I said, though I knew I wouldn't. When the taillights disappeared down the road, the night seemed unnervingly quiet. Mark stepped beside me, his breath visible in the air. "We should get the locks changed again tonight." We called the locksmith from the driveway, and by the time we reached Portland, his van was already parked out front. Inside the cabin, the cold had settled deep in the walls from the door being open so long. The locksmith worked quickly, the hum of his drill and the metallic scrape of new hardware echoing through the stillness. When he handed me the new keys, I slid them into my pocket without ceremony. The weight of them was small, but the shift they represented was not. Mark and I walked through each room, gathering the boxes and bags my parents had carried in. They looked strange here, as if they belonged to some other life entirely. The next morning, I drove to a storage facility on the edge of town. The unit was clean and brightly lit, the air smelling faintly of concrete and cardboard. I stacked their belongings inside, neat and methodical, making sure every bin was sealed and labeled. After locking the unit, I stood there for a moment, my breath clouding in the air. Then I took a photo of the open door, their things lined up like evidence. Back at home, I typed out a message to Sophie. "Here are their things. Paid through the end of the month." I added the address, the unit number, and the entry code before hitting send. It didn't take long for the read receipt to pop up. No reply followed. I wasn't sure if she was ignoring me or weighing her next move, but I didn't care. That night, Mark and I ate dinner in near silence, not from tension but from the kind of exhaustion that seeps in after a day of drawing lines you can't erase. Outside rain began to fall, first in soft streaks, then harder drumming against the windows. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the condensation sliding down the glass and thought about how quickly things had escalated. What started as a quiet refusal at a dinner table had turned into flashing lights in the driveway and the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. And yet, in the steady rhythm of the rain, I felt something like calm settle in. I had acted, not reacted. I had defended what was mine. In that moment, I realized there was no way back to the family we had once pretended to be. And for the first time, I didn't want there to be. 2 days later, my phone buzzed before I had even poured my first cup of coffee. It was a text from Maggie with a screenshot attached. At the top was my mother's profile picture, her arm looped through Gerald's, both smiling on a park bench. Below it was a post written in her clipped dramatic style, the kind she used when she wanted to paint herself as the victim. Our own daughter had us removed from a family cabin like we were criminals. After all we've done for her, she has turned her back on her parents. I scrolled further. Hundreds of reactions. Dozens of comments, many from people I recognized by name if not by face, others complete strangers who had apparently decided they knew enough to weigh in. Words like ungrateful, heartless, and shameful leapt out from the screen. Someone I hadn't spoken to since high school wrote that it was disgusting how adult children abandoned their elders. By the time I finished reading, my coffee sat cold on the counter. Mark was at the sink rinsing a plate, his back to me. "She posted it," I said. He didn't need to ask what I meant. "Let me guess. You're the villain in this story." "Worse," I said. "I'm the cautionary tale." The comments kept piling in throughout the day. Old family friends, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Even the church ladies from my parents' congregation were weighing in. My phone felt heavier with each buzz, as if the judgment of every person in my parents' orbit was pressing against my palm. By late afternoon, I knew I couldn't let it stand. If I stayed quiet, her version would calcify into the truth, and I had already spent too many years letting her tell the story for me. I opened Facebook, clicked into the status box, and let my fingers rest on the keys for a moment. Then I started to type. For 5 years, from 2016 to 2021, I paid the mortgage on my parents' home in Portland. That was $1,600 a month every month plus property taxes, so they would not lose the house when my father's hours were cut and my mother could not work. They promised they would pay me back when they could. They never did. I wrote about sitting in the reception hall at Sophie's wedding when my parents announced they were giving that same house to her as a wedding gift. I described the dinner a few weeks later when they asked to take over my cabin in Silver Pines, the cabin I bought and maintained myself. Then I wrote about the day I got a security alert, drove up to find them moving their belongings inside, and had to call the police to have them removed. I included no insults, no dramatics, just the facts as they happened. I ended it simply. Family is important, but so are boundaries. I will not apologize for protecting what is mine. I read it twice, my heart thudding in my ears, then hit post. It took less than an hour for the tide to shift. The angry comments slowed, then stopped. Under my post, people began asking questions. Is this true? Did they really give Sophie the house? A cousin from my father's side messaged me privately to say she had no idea I'd been paying the mortgage. "I am so sorry," she wrote. "If I had known, I never would have believed what your mom wrote." The most unexpected message came from Robert Flynn, a man who had worked with my father for 20 years at the manufacturing plant. He commented publicly saying he remembered the layoffs in 2016 and how my father had mentioned Hannah is keeping the roof over our heads right now. He wrote that my parents were lucky to have had my help and that anyone judging me without knowing the full story should think twice. Mark read over my shoulder and gave a low whistle. That's going to sting. By evening, my mother's original post had disappeared from her profile. She didn't message me, didn't comment on my status, but I could feel her simmering from miles away. Sophie stayed silent, though I noticed she removed me from her friends list. Later that night, as I sat on the couch scrolling through the remaining responses, I realized my chest felt lighter than it had in weeks. The truth was out there now in my own words, and no amount of her spin could erase it. Mark came in from the kitchen with 2 mugs of tea and set one in front of me. "That went better than I expected," he said. "It went exactly how I needed it to," I replied. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streetlights reflected in small silver pools along the curb. I sipped the tea warm and steady in my hands and thought about how quickly the current can change when you stop trying to swim quietly and start steering for yourself. The phone rang the next afternoon while I was sorting through a stack of bills at the kitchen table. The name on the screen read Janet Harris, my cousin on my mother's side. I had not spoken to her in months, maybe a year, but I answered anyway. "I saw your post," she said as soon as I picked up. Her voice was cautious, almost careful, like she was stepping into a room she was not sure she belonged in. I didn't know half of that. There was a pause before she went on. "I'm calling because, well, I think you should know what's going on with Sophie." My stomach tightened. "What about her?" Janet took a breath. "Mom and Dad stopped by Sophie's place a few days ago. She said they asked if they could stay there for a while. Apparently they told her they just needed some space until things blew over with you." I stared at the pile of envelopes in front of me. "And she said yes." "That's the thing," Janet said. "She told them no. Said they didn't have enough room and that she and Luke were barely keeping up as it is." I leaned back in my chair, letting that sink in. "What do you mean barely keeping up?" Janet hesitated again. "Luke's hours got cut at his firm and Sophie's been dealing with a big property tax bill. She also mentioned the house needs some repairs they weren't expecting. Roof work, maybe plumbing." She sounded stressed. The words landed with a dull weight. For years, I had imagined Sophie's life as an unbroken line of ease and advantage, the golden path cleared for her at every turn. Now hearing that the house my parents had handed her was already straining her, I felt something shift, but it was not satisfaction. "She said she didn't want to get dragged into the middle of all this," Janet added. I let out a breath. "She's already in the middle whether she likes it or not." Janet was quiet for a moment. "I just thought you'd want to know." "Thanks," I said, my voice flat. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time staring at nothing. I tried to summon some sense of vindication, the kind of sharp-edged pleasure that should come from seeing the scales of fate tilt a little, but it never came. All I felt was a low, steady exhaustion, like I had been carrying something heavy for so long that I could no longer remember what it was like to stand without it. Mark came in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. "Who was that, Janet?" I said. "She called to tell me Sophie turned down our parents when they asked to stay with her." He raised an eyebrow. "Surprised?" "Not really. I think she's got her own problems right now." Mark sat down across from me, resting his forearms on the table. "And how does that make you feel?" I almost laughed because the question sounded like something from a therapist's office. "Honestly, just tired." We sat there for a while, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. I realized that somewhere along the line, I had stopped expecting fairness from my family. I had stopped expecting reciprocity or even acknowledgement. What Janet told me did not feel like a win. It felt like the final scrap of an old illusion crumbling away. That night, I went for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool and sharp, the kind that makes every breath feel cleaner. Lights glowed in the windows of the houses. I passed little pockets of warmth I could see but not enter. I thought about Sophie and her new house sitting under a roof she could barely afford to keep over her head. I thought about my parents drifting between plans now that both of their daughters had drawn lines they could not cross. By the time I reached my own front porch, I knew there was no undoing any of it. The story had moved past the point where anyone could go back to the beginning and rewrite it. The best I could do was keep turning the pages one after another until I reached the end. The voicemail came in just after noon the next day while I was loading the dishwasher. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another scam call, but the screen lit up with my mother's name. I pressed play and stood still as her voice filled the kitchen. "We need to talk, Hannah. We know we've made mistakes. We shouldn't have let things get this far. Please call me back." Her tone was softer than it had been in months, almost tentative, as if she was speaking to someone she was afraid might hang up. There was a long pause at the end, the faint sound of her breathing before the line went dead. I set the phone on the counter and braced my hands against the cool granite. The words should have cracked something open in me, but instead they landed in the same place every other olive branch from my parents had landed before. Too late, too shallow, too focused on smoothing over discomfort, rather than facing the truth of what they had done. As I stood there, memories threaded themselves through my mind without invitation. My 12th birthday, when they forgot to pick me up from the skating rink because Sophie had a piano recital. The time I got promoted at my first job and called them on the way home only to be met with a distracted "oh that's nice" before my mother launched into a story about Sophie's engagement. Every Thanksgiving where I spent hours in the kitchen while Sophie breezed in just before dinner praised for bringing a pie from the bakery. The pattern was as steady as it was exhausting. I had been the reliable one, the one who would pick up the slack without complaint, the one who could be counted on to understand. And in return, I had been the one overlooked, my milestones reduced to footnotes in a story that wasn't about me. The dishwasher clicked into its next cycle, a slow, steady hum filling the room. I picked up my phone again, looked at the voicemail icon glowing in the corner, and without letting myself think too hard, I pressed delete. The confirmation popped up on the screen. I tapped yes. When Mark came home that evening, I was on the couch with a book I hadn't managed to read past the first page. He noticed the untouched tea on the coffee table before sitting down next to me. "You look like you've been somewhere else all day." "I got a voicemail from my mom," I said. "She wants to talk. Said they know they made mistakes." He studied my face for a moment. "And do you want to talk to her?" I shook my head. "Not right now. Maybe not for a long time." He nodded slowly. "Are you going to block them?" "For now, yes. I need space, and I don't want to keep flinching every time the phone rings." Mark leaned back, one arm stretched along the back of the couch. "Do you think you'll ever forgive them?" I let the question hang in the air. The word forgive had always felt too simple for something as layered and jagged as this. "Maybe," I said finally. "But if I do, it won't be for them. It will be for me." We sat in silence, the weight of the words settling between us. I felt the faintest shift inside, not toward reconciliation, but toward a kind of acceptance that was my own, separate from whatever they might want or hope for. Later that night, after Mark had gone to bed, I scrolled through old photos on my phone. There were snapshots of the cabin in summer light, of the garden I had planted out front of Mark and me, on the porch with mugs of coffee. My parents were absent from all of them. I realized that my happiest moments in the last few years had not included them at all. I set the phone down and turned off the lamp, letting the room go dark. Somewhere out there, my mother was probably replaying the message in her mind, waiting for a response that would not come tonight or tomorrow or maybe ever. And for the first time, the thought didn't fill me with guilt. It simply felt like the truth. Morning light edged around the curtains, and I woke with the easy calm that follows a decision finally made. The house was quiet. Mark was already out on his run, and the kettle on the stove had just begun to sing. I poured coffee and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The cursor blinked in the search bar while I typed Silver Pines long-term rental. Listings unfurled across the screen. For the first time since buying the place, I was not thinking in maybes. I was thinking in commitments. Claire returned my call before 9. Her voice carried the steady confidence I had leaned on in our meeting. She said she could draft a limited power of attorney that afternoon and email it for signatures. I told her I wanted a clean plan for the cabin. She said that was wise. We agreed that she would be copied on any lease, that the trespass warning would remain on file with the county, and that all locks and codes had been updated. She asked if I felt ready to move forward. I did. By noon, I had a simple listing drafted. 2-bedroom cabin with pine views and a small stone hearth. New roof 2 years ago, updated kitchen, easy drive from Portland when the weather cooperates. I added a line about quiet tenants preferred and a firm note that no subletting or unauthorized guests would be allowed. Mark read it over while he ate a sandwich and nodded. "It sounds like a home," he said. "Not a secret." The inquiries arrived within hours. Most were brief and noncommittal. One stood out. A nurse named Caroline who had taken a position at the small clinic near the lake. She wrote about early morning shifts and the need for a quiet place to rest. She liked to read on porches. She could provide references. We arranged a time for a video call. When her face appeared on the screen that evening, I felt the kind of ease that is hard to fake. She asked thoughtful questions about winter access and the wood stove. She smiled when I mentioned the blue ceramic canisters on the kitchen counter. I told her they would stay. 2 days later, Caroline toured the cabin with the property manager I hired for first showings. She sent me a message after. The morning light in the living room felt kind. She hoped I would consider her application. Claire reviewed the draft lease, added 2 clauses, and sent it back. I took a deep breath and signed. When Caroline returned her signature, something in my chest loosened like a knot finally undone. On the day she moved in, Mark and I drove up with a welcome basket and a stack of clearly labeled keys. The air smelled of wet earth and cold pine. A soft drizzle fell, not enough to chill, but enough to sheen the needles and darken the bark. Caroline arrived in a modest hatchback packed efficiently with boxes. She thanked us and waved off our offer to carry heavy things, insisting she had help coming. I walked her through the small quirks of the place. How the back door sometimes needed a firm push to latch. Where the snow shovel hung. Which breaker handled the old outlet by the hearth. She listened, took notes, and asked when the garbage pickup day was. Friday, I said. She smiled and said she would set a reminder. Before leaving, I stood on the porch with Mark and looked out at the tree line. The rain lightened to a mist. Through the open door, I heard the small domestic sounds of a new tenant settling in. Boxes sliding across the floor. A cupboard opening. The cabin felt occupied in the right way at last, not as a hiding place, not as a bargaining chip, but as a home with its own steady pulse. Back in Portland, everyday rhythms returned with a different clarity. I made lists and crossed them off. Claire emailed the executed paperwork and confirmed that the county had logged the trespass notice. Maggie stopped by my desk at Northwest Living Interiors to drop off a catalog and squeezed my shoulder before heading to a client meeting. Mark and I tried a new Thai place down the street and argued amiably about whether the curry was better than the one we usually ordered. Small things, but they felt like markers, proof that life goes on even when the family mythology falls apart. A week later, an envelope arrived addressed in my mother's compact script. I let it sit on the console for an afternoon while I vacuumed and did laundry. When I finally opened it, a single sheet slid out. The note was brief and careful. She hoped I was well. She said she and my father were in a short-term apartment near the highway, that she had picked up a few shifts at the drugstore to help with expenses. There was no apology written on the page, but there were words about time and misunderstandings and the wish that holidays might still be shared. I folded the letter along the crease and returned it to the envelope. I placed it in a drawer. It did not change anything, and yet it made something plain. They were living with their choices, and I was living with mine. Sophie remained quiet. Through a cousin, I heard that the roofers had finished the repair and that a tax bill had cleared with the help of a small loan. I did not feel anything like triumph. I felt the ordinary relief that comes when a storm passes and a house, any house, stands another season. The old story of fairness had finally drained out of me. There would be moments of contact someday, birthdays, perhaps inevitable emergencies, but they would happen with my boundaries intact. On a rainy Saturday, Mark and I drove out to the coast with no plan except to walk until we were tired. The sky was the color of pewter and the waves moved in deliberate rows. We walked a mile and back, collected one smooth stone each, and stood with our shoes in wet sand until our socks soaked through, and we started laughing. On the drive home, I watched raindrops stitch silver threads across the windshield and felt that strange, simple thing I had been missing for months. I felt like myself. That night, I sat by the living room window with a blanket and watched the rain soften the street into gauzy reflections. The porch light across the way made a small golden island on the sidewalk. I thought about the first time I saw my mother smooth Sophie's veil, the glow on her face I had chased my whole life without knowing it. I thought about the kitchen table in 2 different years, one when I said yes to saving a house, and one when I said no to giving up my own. I thought about the cabin rented now cared for by someone who needed quiet more than I needed empty space. If Sophie was the daughter they chose to celebrate, then they would live with that choice and I would live with mine. It sounded harsh when I first admitted it. Sitting there, it felt like simple math. Mark came in from the kitchen with 2 slices of apple pie. He set one in front of me and sat close enough that our shoulders touched. We ate without talking for a while, the way people do when the noise has finally fallen away. When we finished, he took the plates, and I stayed by the window listening to the water move through the gutters and pool softly along the curb. I do not know what holidays will look like next year. I do not know which family stories will survive and which will fade. I do know this. I did not lose a family. I stepped out of a role that cost me more than it ever returned. I kept what was mine. I made room for peace. If you have ever had to draw a hard line with the people who raised you, I hope you will share how you handled it and what you learned. If this story made you think about boundaries and respect, let me know what part stayed with you. If you want more stories like this, tap like so I know you want me to keep telling them, and follow along so you do not miss the next one.